Okay, we started off with the exercise I asked you to do today. We had a graph, we labeled it, and originally labeled it with numbers that weren't all integers, but then we multiplied them all by 10 and they were all integers. And it's just easier to write this down if these are all integers, okay? It doesn't hurt to have non-integers except that it gets messier. So we got the f, g, and h functions here. And we ask some questions like, where is f0? Now, turned out that a lot of people didn't understand the question well enough to answer it or to understand everything we're going to do about this. And I think that's probably true of, some people in this class. So we started looking a little more closely at what it means for f of x to be 0 and how the graph gives you those results. So here's a graph of y equals f of x. Now we developed this, all this writing wasn't on there as we went through, but we added writing, and then I realized even in orange we had to say some stuff that's not directly relevant to this, but actually it is, okay? Because we addressed stuff that's coming up. In any case, here's our function, right? So I wrote down 4 points, x1, x2, x3, and x4. And I asked the first question. Is f of x 0 for x equals x1? Okay, well, don't look at the answer, look at the picture. Here's x1, here's f of x. Is f of x 0 when x equals x1? How many think it is? How many think it isn't? How many aren't sure? Okay, if you're not sure, it's probably because you don't know how to read the graph well enough, but we're going to fix that. And we're going to fix it really quickly here because you really should, but don't know what happened in your prerequisite courses, okay, or whether that was even important, okay? And we've been kind of assuming people understand this because it's really basic graphs, but I'm finding a lot of people don't. I'm going to have to go through it quickly here. We're not going to spend pre-calculus time on something you're theoretically supposed to know when you come in. But the videos are there. You get a detailed explanation. I definitely recommend it. Anyhow, it's not 0 because, of course, if x equals x1, then this point down here on the f of x graph is x1 f of x1, isn't it? Okay, because, when you have an x value, the associated y equals f of x value is y equals f of x1, right? X now becomes x1. So here's f of x1. It's the second coordinate of this point. And you get that coordinate by coming down here vertically till you hit the graph and you project over, and there's the value f of x1. Okay? So, this statement here says this is f of x1. The y value here is the value of f of x1. Because the function is y equals f of x, right? So y equals f of x1 is where? Wherever f of x is when x equals x1. That's here. That's the value of y. So we project down here, we project over, we get the y value that goes with this x value, and that y value isn't 0, is it? It's, then the first answer I got, is that 0? The answer was no, it's negative. Well, yeah, that's sufficient to say it isn't 0. And that, of course, prompted me to think about a lot of other things that we kind of developed here. Okay, well, anyhow, so then I asked people to graph, sketch their own graph and show me f of x2, f of x3, and f of x4. Okay, well, long story short, x2 is here, that's the point x2, f of x2, and there's the value f of x2. It's still negative, right? But it's closer to 0 than f of x1, right? Okay, then you do f of x3, well, that's going to correspond to the point up here. It has y value that's here. So f of x3 is positive, right? Okay, and then f of x4, well, here's x4, here's f of x4. It's also positive, and it's further from 0 than f of x3, right? So as we go from x1 to x2 to x3 to x4, we have a negative value, and then we have a negative value that's closer to 0. And then we have a positive value and a positive value that's further from 0. Now, if you go from a negative value to a negative value that's closer to 0 to a positive value, and then a positive value that's further from 0, where do you think that 0 is going to be? Where do you think you're going to hit 0? Well, somewhere between the value of x that gives you this and the value that gives you this, right? Somewhere between x2 and x3. So now we ask, well, if we keep moving to the right, like this green here, well, this, if we find the value for this value of x, I didn't give this value a name, but the value indicated by this green mark here, the value is here, right? And that's even closer to 0. So if we go a couple more points, here and here, we stay negative, but we get closer and closer to 0. So as we move through these points here, including these little purple points that you might or might not be able to see well, we're getting closer and closer to 0. But of course, this green point over here gives us a positive value, doesn't it? Now, if we start at this green point and move a little bit to the left and a little bit to the left, we get closer and closer to 0, right? At what point is the value going to be 0? It's going to be 0 when we get to this point, the bingo point. In between the points where we get negatives and the points where we get positives, right? Now that's very much related to this thing called the intermediate value theorem that you have in your text and so forth, and we will be talking about. So it's very important. That's one of the fundamental theorems in mathematics. And it's really important in calculus. If you have calculus in your future, or might have calculus in your future, you really want to understand this. Okay, anyhow, bottom line is f of x is 0 at the point where the graph crosses the x-axis, right? Because if you're on the x-axis, y is 0. X-axis is where y is 0, right? We're trying to find where f of x equals 0, and f of x is what y is equal to. We're graphing y equals f of x. Okay? So the point where f of x is 0 is, well, here's our f function. It's right there, isn't it? And what's the x value? Yeah, negative 20, right? So when I ask the question, where is f 0? The answer is at x equals negative 20. And if you know what the graph is telling you well enough, you understand completely why that is. It's because as you approach negative 20 from here, you have all negative values, don't you? So if x approaches negative 20 from the left, the corresponding y values approach 0. And then if you approach negative 20 from the right, the corresponding y values also decrease, don't they? And they eventually hit 0 here, don't they? So this is a 0, and you need to understand that that's what a 0 is, and that's what it means to be a 0. Okay? So another way of asking, is f of x 0 for x equals x1? No, the picture shows us that it's negative, right? Is x1 a 0 of the function f of x? Well, that's exactly the same thing. Okay, x1 is a 0 of f of x if and only if f of x is 0 when x equals x1, right? You want to think about that. Okay, where is f positive? Well, clearly, to the right of negative 20, your values of the function are going to be positive, right? Values of the function are the y values. If x is over here, the y value directly above or below that is above, and it's positive. If you're to the left of negative 20, the y value is negative, right? So we say that f is positive where? On the interval from 20 to infinity. The interval 20, infinity. okay? And f is negative on the interval from negative infinity to 20, to negative 20, okay? Make sense? We have to see that in order to understand the relationship between these graphs and a third degree polynomial. And that's fundamental to the structure of a polynomial. So here's the h function, here's the g function. I want you to answer the same questions, the same three questions for the h function and for the g function. Okay? So your answer would be h is negative when x equals whatever, right? Positive on the interval, whatever the interval is, negative on the interval, whatever that interval is, right? Okay, so your answer for the h function, the g function, e.g. fill in the blank. H is 0 when x equals whatever. Positive on the interval, right? Negative on interval. Give you just a couple of minutes and ask you to answer that. Write down your answers to those questions, see if you're understanding this.